Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink. Today I've got author and attorney W.F. Twyman Jr., goes by Wink. I also have Dan Wolf, who is the founder of Democracy Counts, CEO and founder, also an attorney. And our discussion today is going to be on reparations. But before we start our discussion, you know how it goes. The first question for everyone is, what are we drinking for this conversation?
Well, I am showing some school pride, Jen, this morning. I have my brandy for the morning in my Harvard Law School mug.
Yes. And that's right, because we are speaking with we've got the Harvard Club joining us on this conversation. So what about you, Dan?
Oh, I am a thoroughly boring person, 200 proof H2O.
Well, I have to let you know that it's a little bit later for me than it is, so it's brunch time, and I am celebrating our conversation with a little bit of a mimosa, but without the orange juice. So we'll So,
good.
anyways, let's start. Obviously, I want Wink. We'll start with you. If you can give a little bit of idea of your position on reparations and where you stand, we'll let Dan do the same, and then we'll jump into a conversation on it.
Well, thanks, Jen. I appreciate the opportunity. And thank you, Dan, for this chance to have a conversation. Dan, what year is it, Dan?
Right now?
Yeah.
What year?
Mm-hmm.
I consider it, let's see, it's 2030. It's day 2 of year 1 AD, after Donald.
And most people, true, but most people would probably say it's the year 2021, right?
Okay,
So
yeah, most people.
So it's a little bit interesting to me that we're having a conversation about reparations for the descendants of American slaves in the year 2021. If it were 1865 or 1867 or 1868, I could see that. But it seems a little bit strange in the year 2021 that we're having a conversation about reparations for the descendants of American slaves. So my position actually crystallized very strongly in opposition to reparations. One day, my friend Jen sent me an email, and she said in passing, well, there are many stories that are replete with crime and poverty, and people believe that's a holdover from American slavery. And she said, I think there's a lot of truth in those stories. Well, I just was stunned and walked to my keyboard. And then I remembered that a leader of the Black Lives Matter group in Chicago had said, looting is reparations. My heart be still. I couldn't take any more. And so my opinions were firmly crystallized against reparations. The major reason I'm against reparations is causation, pure and simple. Show me a name. Name any slaver from the 1600s or the 1700s who caused a flash mob of Black teenagers to rob a drugstore in Philadelphia in 2019. Any name will do of any slaver from the 1600s or the 1700s. Let's try Mr. Willis. Mr. Willis, an ancestor, one of my friends, was a slave catcher in Tidewater, Virginia in the 1790s. Can you show any causation actual between Mr. Willis' activities and that flash mob, that criminal action in Philadelphia in 2019? You can't. Even proximate causation would do for me. Dan, we're attorneys, we understand causation, actual and proximate. There's not even proximate causation. So, I just think that the causation's not there. How does the status of a great, great, great grandmother who was in bondage in Madison County, Virginia in the 1840s, cause a descendant to steal a candy bar from a store in the year 2019 and lie about it? There's no causation. That's just simply low impulse control. That's lack of self-discipline. So when I hear these accounts that crime and poverty in the modern age are holdovers from American slavery in the 1600s and the 1700s, I don't know what to do except to express my opposition. And then some people will say, well, you know, spirits were broken. Spirits were broken in American slavery, and those broken spirits have been inherited to modern day. Well, you know what? Yes, American slavery was one of the most spiritually devastating episodes in American history. I love to read, Dan. I love to read. The only book in my life that I had to put down for emotional reasons that I couldn't finish was American Slavery as It Is by Theodore Weld in 1839. He was a leader, as you may know, of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And he wrote about a barbaric time full of atrocities. I mean, things we would not couldn't imagine in modern era. So yes, I believe American slavery destroyed some spirits during that time, no question about it. But I also know that the time for this discussion about reparations would have been 1865 or 1867 or 1868. You know, I don't want to go on too long because this is a short opening statement, but it occurred to me sometimes the mere words of a descendant of American slavery don't do the trick, Dan. Sometimes it helps to have a visual. And so I want to show you something. Can you see this? Can you see those people?
The reflections are kind of bad, but yeah.
Okay. This is
But
a
yeah,
family. These are my great grandparents.
hold it a little higher.
Okay, these are my great grandparents.
Okay.
And my great grandfather, Robert Brown, was born a slave in 1860, as was his wife, Amy Wilson Brown. Look at them. Look at their family. The little baby up front is my grandma. The little baby. These people are not forlorn. They're not spirit broken. These are people who were resilient. These are people who were concerned about creating a better future, not focused on the defeating past. And so, to sum up, they say that lived experience gives one expertise. I don't have a PhD in Black history. I don't have a PhD in Africana studies, but I have lived experience in my family, a family which descended from American slaves.
Mhm.
Spirits were not broken with my great grandparents or my grandparents. So why would we think there's causation today in 2021 to account for modern day crime and poverty? I just disagree with that because it runs counter to all of my lived experience, and it would dishonor my ancestors to not speak up and oppose reparations for slavery. My great grandfather, there's no record he called for reparations in his lifetime. He knew slavery. He was focused on creating a legacy, farming the land, making sure his kids had a chance to go to college, looking into the future. We have to create our future. We can't focus on a defeating past because if we do, Dan, if we do, we become a defeated people in spirit. That's my opening position.
Well, okay. um, the I do not have a developed case for reparations in the same way that you do. Okay. The I'm feeling a little bit flat-footed on this.
Well,
The
we're friends.
the
We can talk.
yeah. So the two points that jump out at me are one. Well, actually, let's make it three. One, there was slavery and Jim Crow, which Jim Crow cannot be disentangled from slavery. The end of Reconstruction and the terrorism the literal terrorism that afflicted much of the South, and eventually bits and pieces of the North, post-slavery, were and remain to some extent an injury. And in the law and in morality, when an injury is suffered, compensation is due. And so that's point number one. Point number two is, you stress proximate cause. The obviously with distance, we no longer have proximate cause. We do have what we might call stochastic causation. We know that there's that an injury has occurred, and that the consequences of the injury for many people have not been overcome. Because of the structure of racism in the United States. The policies were developed both privately and governmentally. That continued the injury. The creation of sharecropping, the Ku Klux Klan, the housing policies, mortgage policies, redlining, the things that diminished or prevented or in some cases, reversed, the creation of wealth. I mean, your family, was both, perseverant, and motivated and lucky. Other families that may have been just as perseverant and committed were not so lucky, especially in the Deep South. So that goes to the third point, which is your lived experience. Other people have different lived experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't agree with you. I don't disagree with you that people in a mob, in the present day, who are claiming that looting is reparations, are wrong about that. I agree that is not reparations. That abuses the term reparations. Since when does somebody who has not injured you somehow be the person who has to pay you compensation for something that you have not suffered, that your ancestors suffered? So, I think the concept of compensation for injury is the important concept here, because reparations is a lightning rod kind of a term. But compensation, under the law normally requires proximate cause, as you put it.
Right.
Reparations doesn't require proximate cause. I mean, who was it, post-war Germany, who paid reparations to the Jews? And for that matter, why were reparations paid to Israel instead of to the individual Jews who were murdered? It's kind of hard to pay somebody who is dead. So the very concept of requiring proximate cause and identifying a victim, is defeated. And so you can't, it's unfair to require that the concept of compensation be defeated because the murderer has been too successful in his job. Okay, so and if you let enough time pass and you get to say, well, we can't show proximate cause anymore, and stochastic cause is getting kind of murky, that is that we know that there's something out there, but it's getting murky and it's hard to identify anymore. Then suddenly we give a pass to the criminal. I don't think that's very fair. The fact is that for 400 years, people's labor was confiscated, their families were broken up, their ability to create wealth, their ability to create psychologically safe units, social units, the family, were systematically destroyed. All of those things have consequences, and they had consequences that were beneficial, to white elites, and in fact to the broader white economy that was built on that. So the fact that the criminals managed to suppress this for long enough doesn't seem to me give them either a legal or a moral pass.
Well, and I appreciate that. I think that, and I agree with you in part. I mean, I do think that, one, it is a travesty for people in the modern age to mislabel or miscast criminal looting as, as fair and just reparations for the actions of a slaver in 1656 or 1721. Right? That's wrong. And we agree with that. We see eye to eye. And unfortunately, those kind of statements, I think, pollute the public discourse.
Yes,
They
agree.
disconnect us from the reality of what we should be focused on, which is, I think, causation. Moving on to your examples involving Israel and Jews in Germany, I think that's a wonderful example in terms of an injury and not letting the criminals off the hook. The problem for me is, once again, causation. I can see the case for proximate causation between 1940s Nazi Germany and Israel in the 1960s or 1970s. It's what, a 30-year difference? I can't see the reasonable argument for proximate causation between Mr. Willis's actions in Tidewater, Virginia in 1790 and a cousin who may break the law in the year 2021. There's no even proximate causation for me there. So I return to causation. Um, you and I are compassionate people. I think we believe in compassion for the vulnerable. Um, I also believe in the importance of Black heritage, Black achievement, Black tradition. I mean, it's kind of odd for me to say because I'm a preacher, if you will, of the first generation of desegregation in the 1970s. But oddly enough, at root, Black achievement inspires me, it uplifts me. And so, one of my difficulties with the reparations debate is it forces us to focus on catastrophe and atrocities and brutalities in our past. And yes, they are there. Yes, they are there. We know they're there. We know that. I know that. You know that. That's why I couldn't read that book, American Slavery as It Is, from cover to cover without stopping for emotional reasons. But I also know that I have the benefit, the remove from that. If my great grandparents who were slaves could say, let it go, we're going to create a better future for our descendants, doesn't the debate over reparations take us back into a defeated past? I mean, I think my concern is not just causation, but the spiritual corruption it imposes on descendants of Black American slaves. You want to focus on the future. And even during slavery, there were people who were achieving, who were accumulating assets. You know that from our earlier conversations. I mean, I could go on and on and on. My grandmother, who had purchased property in 1921, the year of the Tulsa massacre, she acquired property and she wasn't the first in her family. She was acquiring property as her father and her grandfather had done before her, a former slave. Um, you have my uncles who acquired red brick homes and businesses and property in the 1960s. Um, as you know, Dan, I have an interesting background. It's very multiracial. And one of the things I always find interesting is that if you look at my great, 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 great grandfather, George Twyman III, did he own slaves? Yes, he did. He owned 49 in the year 1790. By the year 1965, the Civil War had come and gone. General George Custer had rummaged through the cupboard in the Twyman home at Oak Lawn. By 1876, the family home was gone. Oak Lawn was lost to bankruptcy. And so by 1965, the white Twymans, the descendants of slave owners, were destitute. They had no electricity, they had no running water, they were poor, shivering in the chill. Black Twymans in the mid 1960s were, relatively speaking, doing well. Red brick homes, running water, electricity, cars, businesses. One of my uncles, Uncle Will Ernest Sr., was probably the biggest Black businessman in the county. And so when I look at those comparisons between white Twymans and Black Twymans over time, does reparations really make sense in terms of the recapturing assets if the white Twymans were destitute in 1965, before the civil rights era took root, and the Black Twymans who were doing quite nicely? Thank you very much. Respond.
The So what we've got here is look, the I can't contest, the empirical. I mean, we're of course assuming that we're all telling the truth here, and I have no doubt that you are. So, I can't contest the empirical data, right? So we have to adjust our thinking around the empirical data.
Right.
There's other empirical data out there. There are people who did not do so well, whites who did very well, and blacks who did not do very well. I mean, look at Mississippi and the sharecropping system, and the lynch mobs, to keep them in line and so on. The I don't know Virginia the way you know Virginia, yeah, but you grew up in an area that was closer, to the national capital. Perhaps the laws functioned better to protect
I was
blacks.
also born in the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. Just a footnote.
Okay, the um, but maybe because it was closer to the center, laws functioned in a more, equal way, that maybe the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution protected blacks in your part of the country better than they protected blacks further out in the hinterlands, where local white mobs, had a freer hand, and maybe they didn't have such a free hand close to the center of the federal government. Those things are possible. But the if I when 9/11 happened, um, the people suffered different kinds of injuries, right? And a trustee was appointed, for a very large to distribute a very large fund in order to compensate victims of 9/11. The compensation was divvied out, according to the injury, and the injury was partly related to the nature of, the level of a person's income. Person receiving, who lost $1 million income, and his family was destitute because he was dead, or might have been destitute otherwise, got a larger payout than somebody who was earning $50,000 as a janitor. So there, arguably, somebody who has overcome the legacies of slavery for whatever reason doesn't need as much compensation for the injury that his or her ancestors suffered as the person who, for whatever reason, has never overcome that legacy, but now that whatever reason can hide a whole host of sins. I mean, so for instance, if you were in Alabama or Mississippi, and the culture and the organized rules of the area, not just the expectations, the attitudes, and so on, but those certainly play into it because they were part of the enforcement mechanism of the written rules. Um, if that continues for years and years and decades, and even a century, what's happening there is you've got a continuation of a crime. Essentially, your slave owner, from 1790, has created a structure that is preserved by fellow conspiracists, that maintained the racket, essentially, the criminal racket that persevered, for a century after the slave owner's death, or more than a century, and we still see some of it. We see what we saw at the Capitol, was in part a kind of a spiritual descendant, of an ancient crime.
If I could
So
jump,
yeah, go ahead.
I like what Dan has said. You've made a very good point, Dan, and I don't often see it in the literature, that there's a nuance and complexity to the Black experience, to Black culture and consciousness. I love hearing that. I really do. And it's because so often I find that me and my cousins and my ancestors who are Black, we don't see ourselves so much in the common discourse about structure and white supremacy and white privilege and white fragility and institutional. You can go on with the slogans. We don't. When we think of our past, we could focus on the bad things, which we all know occurred, right? But we tend to take uplift from our past and to focus on the triumph over the adversity. I appreciate your reference to structure. And that's in commonplace in the public discourse that we have a structure put into place by slave owners which replicates itself. So I get it. I get it. I get it. I also get that in Black history internally, the greatest advance is always made from spiritual elevation, from uplift. The greatest advances. Isn't it something odd to you, Dan, that my great great grandfather, who was born a slave and acquired over 500 acres of land in his life and died in the 1880s, there's no record he demanded reparations for slavery? Or my great grandfather, picture you saw, there's no record he demanded reparations for slavery. On my wife's side of the family, good Lord. We could talk and then some. I'm the poor person in the family, as Dan probably appreciates. But I just think there's so much richness in the Black past. And so I really demand a high standard for causation before I would consider reparations. Now, let me be clear, be true. Let me be true that I don't want to be someone who's rigid and unreasonable. Sometimes my daughter will say, Dad, you're just rigid and unreasonable. I think Jim Crow, redlining, discrimination, those are separate injuries, to use your word. I'm open to a debate about that. I mean, to me, that makes more sense because causation is closer. My father, can you believe this, Dan? My father, who's still living, 86, never attended a day of school with a white classmate. Think about that. Whereas I went through the transition from all Black schools to all white schools. And then my kids who've never attended a school more than, I don't know, 5% Black, 4% Black. In our one family, you've got two bookends. You've got the granddad who knew Jim Crow segregation and all the evils. And you've got privilege, Black privilege, hello. You've got privileged grandkids who are doing the walk at Yale and places like that. So I just think I don't want to be too flippant about it, but I'm in a trial and the judge is just great. And whenever people just hammer on things that just seem just not sustainable, he'll say, what does he say? He'll say things like, what does he say? He'll say like, you're wasting my time. Is this a big deal? What are we doing here? I don't care. Sometimes I feel like that in these discussions because it is 2021. It's not 1865. The people who should have been having this discussion were my great great grandparents. They didn't clamor for it. Why the heck should a great 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 granddaughter privilege private schools, Yale, you name it? He's skipping along saying, ooh, we're going to get reparations. It's ridiculous. It's insanity. So, but Dan, you're so astute. You're so perceptive. I love you as a friend because of that. You make me think. I think Dan is quite right. There is a nuance to Black experience. Perhaps living in Georgia or Mississippi or Alabama creates a different rationale for reparations than living in the shadow of the Capitol Confederacy. I'll give you that. But you still got to show causation for me because you look at your weighing two things, right? There's a great harm, I think, to the spirit of elevation uplift if you focus discourse on past evils, right? Because you always want to create a better future. You don't want to live in a defeated past. If my great great grandfather knew that and my great grandfather knew that, certainly we should know that in the year 2021. Your turn.
So,
Okay.
if I may interject for a second. Because this is part one of many, many conversations, and I think
we could go on, Jen.
Right, we've laid some great groundwork, and before we bring in Q&A, I've got one question for you guys, and I'm almost done with my drink, so let's get to this, and then we'll open up the conversation. But my biggest question is more, how do we even, like, Dan, I would love to hear from you. what is your idea of reparations? Is reparations giving, like, literally giving a check out saying, I'm sorry you had, you were slave, your great grandfather was a slave? Is it, what does reparations look like? I know Wink, for example, and I have written a piece, and he actually did the hard math
Yeah.
on what true reparations would be if we gave everyone who's descended from slaves. And I think that it would have cost, was it 40 quadrillion?
I'll tell you, there was a
Okay.
wonderful study, Dan, done June 19, 2020. It's called The Wealth Implications of Slavery and Racial Discrimination for African American Descendants of the Enslaved, published in the prestigious The Review of Black Political Economy. I encourage all listeners to read this wonderful report. And the report concluded that if you view reparations as a matter of back paid for uncompensated slave labor for all of American slavery from 1655 to 1865, back pay comes out to $6.2 quadrillion, 6% interest, loss of freedom, $16 quadrillion, 6% interest, pain and suffering, the torture, the atrocities, the brutalities. And that's, I just doubled the figure for that. So you're looking at $44.4 quadrillion. No, Dad.
As Everett Dirksen used to say, a quadrillion here and a quadrillion there, and eventually you're talking about real money.
Real money, right? So yeah, so part of me, like the judge, I kind of feel like, what are we doing? We've got COVID, a worldwide pandemic. There are more important things to occupy space in the public square than
let me,
about, things from 2 years ago.
I hear you. So let's draw another fine distinction, another bit of nuance here. There are multiple kind of threads of thinking going on here. There's obviously there's the compensation for direct injuries, that can be traced, to redlining and and not granting mortgages for discriminatory reasons and so on and so forth.
But of course, just to make the point, of course, as I see it, in terms of causation, those are downstream from American slavery per se. But the debate is always right.
So I kind of want to work upstream, a little bit here. There are clear linkages between the policies of the recent past and even today, and the structure of racism and oppression that followed the end of slavery, which of course is in turn connected to slavery as a system itself, which was a major part in the building of this country. Okay, so there are some things, that some injuries where we can tie together the proximate cause, and the injury itself, and some reasonable form of compensation. I mean, I was listening to just yesterday a congressman, a Japanese American congressman, talking about how his grandfather's property I think in Hawaii, he bought for $2,500 in the 1920s, and during the internment, the property built up a tax lien, and when his grandfather and father got out of internment, they couldn't pay off the lien, and they lost the property, and the ground was worth $25 million today. But there's a Holiday Inn on it, and so on and so forth. So this kind of that's probably race-based, and it's not race-based against blacks in that case. But there is a kind of an insensitivity, to the injuries that are suffered by people who are not powerful or who do not fit into majority white culture. So that I think we can talk about, in a way that doesn't necessarily have to reference, reparations or reference slavery per se. So that I think that is a way of getting around. That's more like, like we've got an injury that comes from this historical cause, and we can deal with it, in a traditional kind of a trustee-based compensation scheme.
And you bring me closer to your position when you make that clear that it need not be linked or tied to American slavery. I'll give you a great case in point. So, I mentioned my great great grandfather, Daniel Brown, who owned 500 acres of land probably by the 1870s, and he'd been born a slave. I did some calculations maybe a month ago. If all of those acres had remained in the family, today they would be worth $40 million. That's a lot of money. So what probably happened over time? Well, he had 16 children. Two died in childbirth, four passed for white. So the remaining 10 got 1/10 of the acreage. And they probably, either over leveraged their property. They probably may not have paid property taxes. They may have been swindled out of it. Who knows? But I do know that over the generations, there was a dwindling down of that property so that today, the great great grandkids were not worth $40 billion. But there is a sense among distant cousins of what might have been if the property had remained intact over those generations.
Sure.
So that is kind of a haunting sensation, if you will. It is. But once again, I'm like an old broke record. If you look at reparations as injury and compensation for uncompensated slave labor, suppose the slaves had been compensated. There's no guarantee the money would have stayed in the family over the generations. People might have gone to the gambling hall or gone to a lady of the evening or engaged in bad investing. We sometimes presume that to make people whole, you have to make sure everyone who was a slave was fully compensated for their labor back in the 1600s and 1700s, 1800s, and presume that that would have stayed intact. I don't think so. I think history tells us very rarely does wealth remain intact in families over 5 generations. It's quite uncommon, actually. So I think that's another point to consider as well. But the one thing I love about this conversation, Dan, is you and I, while we disagree, we are clear in our disagreements and we reach for points of commonality. We keep our minds open to compromise or some inner consensus. And I think that's how people should approach these difficult issues. The point is not, Dan, good friend Dan, the point is never to dominate someone, right? Or to assert power over someone who differs. We grow most as a country and as a society when we value a search for commonality, when we value a search for purpose, a search for meaning. Viktor Frankl didn't write Man's Search for Power, right? He wrote Man's Search for Meaning. So I think that Black people have always known that we're at our best when we're driven by the spirit to aim high in life. We're not at our best when we live in resentments and grudges in a defeating past. That's not where we excel. I just think that in the year 2021, like that judge might say, what are we doing?
Yeah, well, let me come back to this because and you sort of jumped ahead to talk about the kind of the meta conversation. But I want to use that as a segue, and then Jen, I'll shut up and
Sure.
we can go to the next stage.
Notice Jen hasn't said much.
Pardon? What?
You guys make you all. I'm listening.
Yeah.
Go on, Dan.
This issue about uplift, this issue about meaning. I mean, Viktor Frankl's book. In my 20s when I read it, it was a very powerful book. It really affected.
It's behind me.
Yeah, and but what do we say to a young Black man and his friends who only feel safe on their block, in on the west side of Chicago, who have never had a chance for a decent education, who have seen their parents and their grandparents systematically robbed, of their property. They bought a house on contract because they couldn't get a mortgage, and then they missed one payment and they lost the house. and the house is resold a second time, a third time, a fourth time. You know, the you know, they see this power structure in a visceral way, and they see it acted out, you know, in a highly detailed way. It's a macro power structure that has tendrils that extend right down to their daily lives. Okay, and that power structure reaches back to a racist and past, a past in which the United States created a subcaste of Americans. And I think this concept of caste is important. You know, that
Wilkerson.
pardon?
Wilkerson, the book, lady worked the
Yes.
book Caste.
Right,
Yes.
exactly. But I lived in India for a year. I got familiar to a certain extent with caste. Caste has positive virtues and it has negative virtues. And you can be, you know, you can be in a caste and be poor or rich, but it gives you certain benefits. And so we created a white caste that could oppress a black caste no matter what their income was, except if they had the power to do so in their local power structure, right? So one of the things that reparations, the concept of reparations gets at, and I think what motivates this you know, this thinking of like, I'm going to grab, you know, a pair of Ray-Bans and that's reparation for slavery. Well, what it is it's a, of course it's opportunistic, but it's also, I think, at a deep level, you know, an attempt to impose a reckoning that the United States has not done.
What does that mean? Like, define for me what a day of reckoning would mean.
No, I'm not talking. No, not Day of Reckoning. Day of Reckoning is like apocalypse. You know, like,
right.
it's like the Boogaloo. We're not going there. Okay, that's a different sense of reckoning. Okay, the but I mean, look at the truth commissions. You know, in Argentina and South Africa. You know, where, you know, and in Germany with the denazification. You know, it's a reckoning with the past. It's an admission. Look, the South, the South after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, they recreated this sterile image, you know, of the antebellum world, you know, and so kids, you know, I don't know about now, but kids over this last century grew up with this, you know, this perfect picture of a Dixie, you know, that, you know, was almost Disney-like, you know, and so that makes the reckoning harder because people's views, you know, of slavery and the impact, you know, or get all confused. You've got the victims and you've got the victors, but
Dan, you know what I think?
Pictures. Yeah, go
You know
ahead.
what I think about a reckoning? I'm going to channel my judge. You know what I think about a reckoning, Dan? I think a real reckoning would be for every Black American, every descendant of American slavery, to be honest, to be truthful about who you really are in terms of your full family heritage, your full genetic heritage. I mean, one of the great turning points in my life, as you know, Dan, has been doing 23andMe, ancestry.com, and discovering not kind of this false sense of who I am. Well, you're 100% descendant of American slavery. I mean, I probably thought that into the year 2016 or 2017. But by looking through the records and the data, I've discovered a whole new universe of people who are part of me, Twymans. Learning that I'm, you know, a descendant from George Twyman the First, who was an English immigrant to the U.S., came here in 1677 in Virginia. And in terms of reckoning, I mean, I think that's what truth and reconciliation is all about. Recognizing that you're not just this forced other. The truth is you're part of the greater humanity in Virginia or the greater humanity in Missouri or Virginia. Little story. I was on my walk this morning. Jen knows I like to do walks before these podcasts. And I was just walking down the road and I saw this cute little kid. She was like maybe 1 or 2 years old. She was white, blue eyes, blonde hair. And her dad was holding her. And she was looking at me and she waved and said hi. And I said hi in return. For most of my life, that would have been it. I would have taken no special meaning for that or had no special thought. But because I now know that my Twyman cousins, some of them look like her, it kind of created for me a click of kinship in her. She could have been one of my distant cousins for all I know. So I think that deep ancestry is really a truthful way for truth and reconciliation, because you force people who have ties through genetics and blood and name to recognize they're one, that they have commonalities. This I have done 2 podcasts with distant cousins who are white. Um, the writer James Twyman and the professor Nathan Twyman, and then we have another one for February planned with Brittany Twyman. And I just think it's wonderful. It's wonderful how people can have a sense of family and know one another, and that they have a shared history, even though outside forces would force us to look at things purely as a matter of black or white. I just don't think that gets us very far. I think if we grow to see that we're part of a larger family, that's the way towards a greater end. Dan, joy is in common humanity. Joy has never been in a divisive, defeatist past. Yes, we know horrible things happen. Yes, no. I was telling Jen the other day, maybe a few months ago, that this reparations thing just struck me as so off key. I was born in Richmond, Virginia. I have thought more about slavery in the past 2 years, 3 years, than I did between 1961 and the year 2018. And I grew up in the capital of the Confederacy. So it just seems a little bit strange to me, this whole debate.
I applaud your your expansive view of humanity, but I want to make 1.5 points.
Sure, go ahead.
Take it home, Dan.
It shouldn't be solely on the shoulders of the short end of the stick to have to do this. The rest of us have to do this. It's the problem.
Sure.
The reason that there are pissed off people, in Minneapolis and so on, making these crazy statements about this being reparations, is because they are pissed because the rest of society isn't doing what you're doing. It's like, it's very nice that you've encountered white relatives, who are welcoming you into their midst. But I'll bet you that kid on a corner, in West Side Chicago, is not finding a whole lot of kumbaya on the part of his white relations, not to mention his non-white relations. Or rather, his white non-relations.
But are they seeking out one another? That's the thing.
This is the thing. I mean, you have these programs of Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation. Mm-hmm. They are micro in size, right? Mm-hmm. So you need something that is more social, more broad-based, something where we can all, confront, the legacy, the reality, the simple facts of our history, and then say, okay, I'm not walking around feeling guilty about the sins of my forefathers. Okay. I choose to do something about it, and then I don't have any guilt about it. But if I weren't doing anything about it, then I might.
Well, I think, Wink, we have got one of the things that we're working on is this idea of bringing ancestry into these conversations. So I'm glad. I think we should end on that for this podcast. And this is the start of many other similar conversations. So we'll pick this back up. But I love that, Wink. I think that if we, and maybe that's part of a solution that we haven't discussed before, is bringing this big, truth and reconciliation within both Black and white families to go, oh, hey, guess what? You're my brother. You're my sister, and as part of one solution when we talk about reparations. So you guys, thank you so much for having a drink with me. It has been a pleasure. I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website, where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.